Hello colleagues, and a warm welcome to your new DAC roles. I'm Honor Gay from the Bats in Churches project, and I have 10 precious minutes to engage you with a pretty complex issue, that of bats in churches. And what I'd like to do in this brief time is three things: to open your eyes to the wonderful world of British bats, to explain why bats in churches can be problematic, and to give you tips and advice to help PCCs and their bats. British bats. Bats are remarkable and endearing creatures. In the UK, we have 18 species, a third of our mammals. They're the only mammal with true flight. And to many people's surprise, their reproductive biology is pretty similar to ours. They are nothing like mice or rats. They're long-lived, up to 30 years. They don't reproduce until they're 2 or 3 years old, and they only have one pup a year. In spring, pregnant female bats form maternity roosts. They gather together, give birth, and raise their young. The mother-child bond is strong and very touching to witness. In terms of their habits, British bats are exclusively insectivorous, and they are very important pest controllers for agriculture. Now, bats and disease. Bats are not disease vectors in Britain. There is a vanishingly small chance of contracting rabies from a bat in Britain, but only if you're bitten by a bat. If you don't touch a bat, you are completely safe. And just to give some idea of the very small risk, since 1986, only 35 infected bats have been found out of 15,000 samples. But bats in Britain are not thriving. All 18 species have declined significantly over the last 50 years, and 4 species are classified by the International Union of Nature Conservation as being under an imminent threat of extinction. Human activity continues to pose many threats to their survival. Agricultural intensification has decimated their insect prey. Barns are converted, dwellings upgraded. This leads to destruction of their roost sites. Development, artificial light, and cats don't help the situation. And as a result, thank goodness, all 18 species are legally protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, 1981, meaning that it's a wildlife crime to harm a bat or a roost site. Destruction of a maternity roost wipes out breeding females and the next generation of bats, and it has significant effects on local populations. Thanks to the legislation, in part, some species are now thankfully beginning to recover in number. So bats in churches, what are the issues? You'll remember bats are highly protected under the law, but in churches, unlike in most dwellings, bats and people share space. This means that church communities and heritage are not protected from the impact of bats, and here I'm talking about poo and wee. Churches have become increasingly important roosts for bats as their options dwindle in the wider countryside. This is especially the case in intensively farmed areas such as East Anglia, where the graveyard might be the only place harbouring bats' insect prey. Bats are truly seeking 21st century sanctuary in churches, and like humans seeking sanctuary, they're getting a mixed reception. It's important to say that many, if not most, church communities with bats live alongside them in Christian tolerance, but some PCCs really do struggle with the impact of bats in their churches, and because of the legal protection afforded to bats, these communities can feel unheard, and lacking in agency. They can feel that the bats are considered more important than the mission or heritage of the church. So the issues, what are the problems for churches with bats? There's no doubt bats can cause mess and extra cleaning, and with cleaning volunteers hard to come by, this can create a real problem. Our cleaning and conservation support for PCCs is one of the most valued parts of our work. Bats can also complicate building works in terms of needing the professional advice of an ecologist. There can be seasonal constraints and the necessity to work around them. Also, a bat license might be necessary from Natural England, and this is more administration for the volunteers on the PCC. Here's Holy Trinity Church in Tattershall, which has a huge number of bats. It has 8 species, including a whopping 800 strong maternity colony of soprano pipistrelles. They are very, very impacted by the bats, but they actually take advantage of the bats, they interpret them, and they use the bats in fundraising. Here is, at the other end of the scale, is St Lawrence Radstone in Northamptonshire. And here the church was closed because of the impact of bats. And thanks to the project, an ecologist and architect worked together to enclose the bats legally into a roof void. And this Christmas, the church held the first service, a rededication service, and the church is now operable again. So what can churches with bats do? The most important thing is that to understand that there are lots of ways for PCCs to live more easily with their bats. The first and the most important, and I can't stress this enough, is engage with their bats. Don't ignore them. Understand them, just as a PCC needs to understand the architectural and engineering constraints of their church. Suddenly finding bats when the scaffolding is up is a logistical and financial disaster for a PCC. Knowing whether they have bats, knowing where they are before going into a project is a huge advantage. Don't be taken by surprise. Secondly, build a relationship with the county bat group. County bat groups can be wonderful sources of knowledge and support, and I would urge you to urge PCCs to get in touch with their bat group. Living alongside bats is certainly the easiest and most cost-effective way forward where it's possible. Covering sensitive areas and heritage can help to make cleaning easier. Community cleans in spring and summer can keep on top of the problem. Just a note here that while masks and gloves should be worn for clearing, bat poo and weed does not carry disease. When it's left to accumulate, the mold and fungi spores can cause respiratory issues, as in all old buildings, hence the advice to wear a mask. Bats can be an asset to a church. They can attract fresh faces to engage and help. We've held church bat walks that have attracted over 100 people and raised lots of money for the church upkeep. St Sampson's in Cornwall has raised almost £4,000 through an Adopt a Bat campaign. In some cases, it's not feasible to carry on coexisting, and in these cases, the PCC may want to explore separating the church community from the impact of their bats, legally and without harming the bats. Now's the time to find a professional ecologist. The PCC should recruit them as carefully as they do a church architect. They need, in addition to their technical skills, to be knowledgeable and empathetic towards the plight of the church. In order to come up with a solution, the ecologist, architect and PCC need to work as a team and really listen to each other. It's not cheap. Professional fees for the ecologist and architect can come to several £1,000s, and this might lead to capital work such as at Radstone. Just going back to this key important point, how to find out more about bats in the church. There's a national Bat Helpline, and PCCs can call the National Bat Helpline for a volunteer bat roost visit. This might take a little while to arrange, but it's free to the PCC. As I said before, get in touch with the County Bat Group, really dedicated, knowledgeable experts and professionals. Also, take part in the National Bats in Survey, National Bats in Churches survey that we are running through the project, and go to batsinchurches.org for more information. Or indeed, engage a professional ecologist as you would an architect. So finally, what can DACs do? DACs can help PCCs understand their bats. Know ecologists within the diocese who are confident to work with churches and have a relationship yourselves with county bat groups. Until 2023, please do build relationships between churches with bats and our project. Just get in touch with me about that. When a church comes to you and they have bats for faculty, bear in mind that they have a whole nother set of constraints, and be very mindful of the fact that capital works can normally only be carried out between in early spring and after October. And finally, help to bring more positive, measured views about bats with the built heritage community. That is a very brief canter through bats in churches. Please do get in touch if you have any more questions, and thank you very much for listening.